Dear listener, before we really start this podcast, I ask you to rate and review this podcast wherever you listen to it, whether it's iTunes or YouTube or wherever it is. This will help us to make a more relevant content for you. Thank you so much. Hello and welcome to Future Procurement Podcast. My name is Robert Freeman, and together with me on the direct Skype call from New Zealand is Margaret Gilbert. Hello, Margaret.
Hello, how are you?
It's good evening for you and it's good morning for me because of 12-hour time difference. But this makes our talk even more fun.
Yes, indeed.
Yes, for those of you, dear listeners, who are listening to us for the first time, Margaret is a procurement consultant and trainer and author of Contract Matters books, a series of books covering procurement. And today Margaret will help all of us to understand goals and action plans and the best practice for setting the goals and action plans. Right, Margaret?
Indeed.
And you said in the beginning of our discussion before we push the record button that in the previous podcast episode we were talking about the procurement strategy, and this should be a natural step right after that.
Correct. Yep. The procurement strategy is really an overarching document, and of course you then have to implement the procurement strategy, and to do that you obviously need to consider your goals and action plans.
So let's dive into the goals and action planning. What are the best practice?
Sure. Well, I think it's useful to actually sort of provide an example of what is a goal and what is an action plan. So that's probably a good start. So a goal is, as an example, is to, for example, implement a new IT system. So that can be a goal. An action plan from that is that you would need to prepare an action plan and present to management, and be clear about how you're going to go about implementing this new IT system. So an action plan can be, and I'll give you about five examples what you'd expect to find in an action plan, and that would be in terms of like preparing a business case, finding your budget, because you can't do much without a budget, research your options in terms of this new IT system, prepare a report for management so to keep them informed, consider any training requirements, and lastly, an implementation plan. So that's an action plan. And an action plan is the steps it'll take to achieve the goal. So I just thought that might be useful to do. I'm sure everyone understands that, but, just from
Yeah, it's good to set the base before we dive into it. Agree.
Exactly. And sometimes, and the reason why I said it is because sometimes people rush into sort of, for example, implementing a new IT system or buying a new IT system, and they might have the goal, but they don't necessarily have the action plan. So,
absolutely.
If you don't put in the preparation stuff, and if you don't consider what's necessary, then you're going to come up a bit short, aren't you?
Yeah.
So from a best practice perspective, it's a good idea to be really clear about what you're doing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So in terms of a piece about goals, so the question is, do you have? And if you do have, then you're more likely to achieve the specific goals if you at least know what they are, and even better to write them down rather than trying to keep it in your head. And as you go through your goals, is then tick them off when you've completed. And again, let's just reiterate what we just said a couple of minutes ago about the goals are coming and separated out from the procurement strategy, of course.
Yeah.
And like most things, everyone's in a rush to get it done, but you have to have a realistic time frame. And especially when it comes to looking at a new IT system as an example, because you have to do the research. You have to be able to sort of see what needs to occur, and for it to before you start implementing, and then you've got to sort of obviously take the time to implement, and then obviously any training requirements, etc. So it's just easy to sort of say, okay, we'll do it in 1 week or 1 month or whatever. But if you've got lots of things that you've got to do from a time frame perspective, then really it's, from a procurement perspective, it's a good idea to get all your ducks in a row, so to speak, and to get it sorted.
So first, to have the time frame, and then second is to have it realistic, because I have seen also lots of action plans even with the goals and but with no time frames. And of course this is even worse if I say like this, then you don't understand what do you prioritize and things like that.
Yes.
So have the time frame and have it realistic.
Yes. There's no point sort of saying 1 month if it's going to take 3, 4, 5, 6 months.
Exactly.
So it has to be reasonable. And I think this is unfortunately some things that go a little bit wrong with sort of underestimating in terms of time, not realizing how long it will take to put in place, all that sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And a goal will provide you with a blueprint going forward, which of course a blueprint is a good form of best practice really, in terms of saying what you should do versus sort of being careful of what you should not do, etc. Yeah. So it sounds simple, but it can be a bit more difficult than that. And it is useful to have, because it can go terribly, terribly wrong if you don't have something written down or something stated that's what you're trying to do. So a goal really needs to be what you want to achieve, and and five strategic points that you want to take into account, and what you have to do to achieve. All these things are useful to have to do. And like most things, if you're going to try to put something in place like an IT system or whatever, then you're going to have to ask lots of questions. Because if you don't ask questions, then you won't get the answers, and then you're not 100% sure whether, from best practice perspective, as to whether you're going to actually achieve the best that you could do. Yeah. And of course, like most things, you can't just implement a IT system across the organisation without communicating that's what you're going to do, and to bring them up to speed and bring them in place in terms of, communicating to and again, I mentioned this word, I hate it, but anyway, stakeholders, and to, for the organisation to be able to ask questions, and so they can sort of feel like they're brought into this thing. Because you'll achieve buy-in better if they understand what you're trying to do.
Exactly. What are the best practice to communicate this? Is it the best to be done via physical meeting or via...
I think more a case of just communicate the goals. I don't think that most people in the organisation is going to care too much about best practice. They're assuming that the procurement people will ensure that it is, best practice in terms of how they're going to go about it.
Okay. Maybe you're right.
Unless you consider that you wish the whole organisation to be aware of the total goals.
But very important is to communicate, yes?
No. Best to communicate to the whole organisation, because it's going to affect everyone in the organisation, especially if it applies to an IT system, because there's probably going to have to be a training need, and it's going to have to be implemented, and it's probably going to have to make sure that the testing's done, all this sort of stuff, and that's best practice too. Make sure that it gets tested before you agree to sort of taking it on and agreeing to the final product, so to speak, because otherwise, if you don't test and then it goes horribly, horribly wrong, then, it can be rather messy.
Exactly.
The other thing is that while we're talking about asking questions, it's also a good idea to actually for the rest of the organisation to ask questions if they feel a need to. So have a two-way conversation rather than a one-way conversation, because a one-way conversation is not really a conversation at all.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? And if you want it to go smoothly, and then it's probably best to sort of keep everyone informed. And I think the most important thing to think about is that procurement can have its own goals, but it has to link into the organisational goals. And my example that I've been using in terms of an IT system obviously would link into both organisational goal and procurement goal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So to have a clear bridge between, or to have a harmony, let's call it like this, between organisational goals and your own goals, right? that
Yes.
it will not be in dysfunction or creating any dysfunctions to entire company, right?
Correct. Yep. There should not be much difference or significant difference between the procurement goal and the organisational goal, because procurement is really undertaking what the organisation requires. So, yeah. And sometimes while procurement might operate in isolation, that still does not mean that your goals should be significantly different than the organisational goals.
Yeah.
And that's certainly best practice, because you don't want to be going the opposite direction of the organisation. I mean, you're a part of the organisation, but you don't want to be going in the wrong direction. You need to be going in the same direction as the organisation. Otherwise, you've got a dysfunctional sort of organisation then, don't you?
Yeah.
Alrighty. So the other thing to think about is the timeframes that you want to do this, and goals should have timeframes, and that should be coming from the procurement strategy, which of course has already been agreed by the management. So therefore, that's kind of, everyone's agreeing to this thing. So just like the procurement strategy has timeframes, so should the goals.
Yeah.
Because if we talk about, as we did, the procurement strategy in a previous podcast, is that we can look at short-term, medium-term and long-term when it comes to a strategy. And so therefore, and the three can run in tandem, but they're obviously going to take a longer time frame to achieve. So therefore, your goals and action plans should sort of have different timeframes to them as well. And that is good practice in terms of being very clear about what is able to be achieved in a short to medium to long term scenario. Yeah. And the trouble is that while you might have a plan, like most plans, they don't necessarily, some things can happen to affect that plan. So your timeframes, or like everything else, might have to be adjustable, so to speak.
Yeah.
Because, it'd be great if it all went perfectly well, but life is not always like that.
Yeah. And of course, also, it's not good to be late to achieve some goals. So, it's a good feeling when you are in time with your goals. So
yes.
think from the beginning if you want to build in some contingency, some risk scenario
yes.
into that.
Yeah.
So think from beginning what can go wrong, because obviously something will go wrong if the goal is big enough, if the goal is ambitious
yes.
enough.
Yes. You'll think, what could possibly go wrong? This whole thing has got movable parts. So there's always good idea as a part of your early planning to think about risk. What are your risks? What's the organisational risk? What's the risks if something goes terribly wrong? Could the organisation survive if the IT system, when it was implemented, didn't work the way it was expected to? You know what I'm saying? Maybe it's a good idea to run the systems in tandem for a little while to make sure that the new systems works, rather than just chopping off the old system and relying hopefully that the new system will be okay. So risks is always a good thing to think about. Again, we talked about that when it was in relationship to the procurement strategy.
Yeah.
Because sometimes you need to probably have to, in some instances, it might be an idea to halt the procurement until the risk level can be reduced. Unless the organisation is happy for the risk to be there and accept the risk, etc. But to me, it would be a good idea to try and reduce the risk before going ahead. And this, to me, is normal best practice stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, so basically from there you've got your goals, and then you have to come into your action plans, which of course, and which provides the specific operational details. It's the how-to in a way, the steps that you need to take, timeframes that you need to do. So you've got strategy, the goals, then the action plan. Yeah. And just for the example we've been using in terms of the IT system, then if that's going to be implemented over a period of 2 financial years, as an example, then you've got to consider the operational details as to across that time frame, because you're assuming that if you don't immediately have the monies, and you're hoping that you do, but if you don't, if it's going to go over 2 financial years, is how much can be done in the 1 financial year and how much will have to be left to the 2nd financial year, and is that going to sort of cause any issues?
Exactly.
Yeah. So putting in place a time structure is really useful.
Yeah.
Yep. And of course, if you're talking about an IT system, I assume that you need to get approval from management one way or the other, whether it's senior management or immediate management or whatever. And of course, all of this has to be put together, business case, budget, all that good stuff for approval and sign off. And the other big issue in all of this, in terms of goals and actions, is to make sure that you've got the resources. Because if you don't have the resources, i.e. people resource, then it could be much harder to achieve. Yes. And so from a best practice perspective, you're better off making sure you've got plentiful resource. And that can be difficult in this time and age, when perhaps appropriate resources is a bit hard to find in some instances. Yeah.
Yeah, but even if it's not specific resources, it will work 100% of time for your plan or for your activities. But even they can come from the other organization, and having this kind of a project-oriented way of working. So not being maybe fully under your control, if I say it like this, but being a part of your team. So also consider this maybe.
Yes.
How to use the existing resources first of all in the best way. But
yes, because if you've got to talk about a project team, procurement is a part of that, but it's not necessarily either running it. But so there's only a small portion. So as long as procurement is doing its thing, so to speak, that's aligning again with the project, which is aligning with the overall organisational requirements. You've just got to make sure all the players, so to speak, on the project team are aware of not leaving things to the last minute from a procurement perspective, because sometimes that happens and then they go, oh, actually, we need to actually buy this thing. Mm-hmm. So it does take a bit of oomph and effort and time. So the best practice from that side of things is to make sure that the project team is absolutely up to speed with what's required. Yeah. So it's kind of simple, really. So when you've achieved it, when you've got the goals are clear, the action plans are in place, and the direction is known, and that the research has been done, the budget has been approved, the research has occurred, and all that sort of thing. So, and again, making sure that you align it to the procurement strategy, so that you're absolutely clear as to the expectations of everyone involved, and the communication to the organisation, and everyone is happy. And one way of doing that is probably to not only just put written communication around the organisation, but it could be useful to actually go and speak to separate groups or different groups or the whole organisation in a big organisational meeting or whatever, and achieving buy-in that way.
Fantastic.
So what happens if you don't have goals? Well, you can probably still get there, but is the result going to be the same? And the answer is not likely. If you don't have action plans, or you're not a part or include yourself in terms of a project team, then the procurement of an IT system, as an example, is probably not going to go particularly well. So
just to summarize it, the first thing that you said was really like the main starting point, is that it should go out from procurement strategy, and it should be in harmony with the goals and actions of total organization. Exactly. Yes. You also said that it should be anchored with the key stakeholders, and it should be agreed and communicated properly with the main stakeholders, but also with your team who will be responsible for this, right? You should have their buy-in. That's right.
Yep. And the thing about stakeholders is that there can be major stakeholders and minor stakeholders, and you need to treat each a little differently, don't you? So that has to be included in your goal. Really, is that if you are the ones that you need to keep informed all the time, then do that. And if there are minor stakeholders that just want to know every now and then you can obviously keep them informed as well. Yeah. And again, that is good practice to do that. And it depends on who those stakeholders are. If they're senior management or board members or something like that, they are important. I mean, if it is just sort of and somebody who's just got an interest because they just have an interest, then they don't need to get as much attention, so to speak, as your key stakeholders do.
Exactly. And also you said about having a clear implementation plan, to have it documented, to have it with responsible people, to have the good resources, budget, time frame for your action and implementation plan.
That's right. In terms of implementation plan, it's really got to be sort of very clear in terms of time frames as to and what has to happen first, what has to happen second, third, fourth, etc. And to be absolutely clear as to what's required. And often a part of that implementation plan is a training piece. And when we're talking about in this as an example in terms of an IT system, then obviously that training piece might take, depending on the number of staff, of course, might take weeks to sort of actually do, and for people to be comfortable with the new system. And again, that comes into, well, at what point are you going to cut off the old system and what point are you going to cut in the new? Yeah. And of course, there's always going to be somebody who's away or sick or on leave or whatever, so you might have to always sort of do a bit of a retrain as well, just to catch the ones that weren't there to begin with.
Exactly. And also what we said and what we agreed, that it should be a structured work, that it should be a work that reoccurs, that is not one-time activity, but it's happening on the regular base, and we have the revision or the new process after 1 year, for example. This is probably how it mostly happens in most of procurement organizations. Is once every financial year you have this process.
So before you start doing something similar or different again, is that you probably should be reviewing how it went the first time, and maybe you need to update those goals, update those action plans, and sort of perhaps another way should be undertaken if in fact how it was done originally if it didn't work particularly well. So always a good opportunity to look at how you did something and see if you can improve going forward.
Exactly.
And whether your budget is sufficient or not, or, And the other thing you need to think about, especially in terms of an IT system, and as another form of best practice going forward, is to make sure that a new IT system can be upgraded reasonably easily or updated reasonably easy, so that you're always not just having to buy new. You can absolutely just, the add-ons become important, so it becomes still relevant, because you don't want to buy an IT system every 5 minutes, do you?
And this can also be done as a part of the risk evaluation or these contingency scenarios that we were talking about a little bit before.
Sure. So, well, having contingencies is a good idea, because if you're, and the other thing you got to think about is if one of those contingencies is the need for more money, which often is the case when it comes to IT kind of stuff, and where's that money going to come from? But equally, contingency in terms of if there is a delay, what is that going to affect for the rest of the organisation, or is there got no consequences and it's a little delay isn't going to hurt too much? But if the delay is going to hurt, then you need to incorporate that into your thinking. In terms, for example, have a plan B, as in what are we going to do if there's a delay? What does this mean for everything else that has to continue? Yeah.
And this kind of risk evaluation and contingency planning could be a good idea to add to each of the actions that you have in your list.
So if you've got 5 let's just make it 10 action points action plans. Then you probably underneath each, there needs to be a time frame attached, or some issues that you need to consider under each, or any kind of risk issue. If there's a delay, what's that going to mean? So your action plan just can't sort of have 10 points to it. It actually needs more detail under that.
Exactly.
Yeah. And if it's over time, and if it's a part of a project team that you mentioned before, then it probably needs to be updated as you go, so that you tick off what you've done, and you know what you've got to do, what needs to happen in the remaining time frame, and work through the issues there. And if any risks have changed that might have been medium to low to start with, and all of a sudden is becoming increasing, then that needs to be included in your risk stuff, in terms of saying, okay, where are we now? Is it safe to continue? Not safe to continue, etc. Yeah. And that's all a good idea to have, and part of your best practice, really.
Yeah. Yes, but of course it's a fantastic feeling to tick off some of the points, hopefully all of the points from your action plan, and saying, yes, we have achieved the goal.
And can be depressing if you can't tick off the points that you want to tick off. Yeah, and then it becomes a bit depressing, so to speak, if that's the right word.
And I think we shouldn't forget that it's human who are working in our companies and in our procurement organization. And if you are dealing with action planning and goal setting, please also keep it in mind that you want to, in the end, have a good climate in your organization, at least to have a constructive climate in your organization. Yes. And I think the good goal setting and action planning will reduce this kind of stress from everyday dilemmas and everyday challenges that companies have, and give a little bit of a longer perspective. At the same time, when you achieve the goals and when you tick off the actions, as we said before, it gives you the understanding of, yes, we are doing something bigger than just everyday problem solving, right?
Yes, indeed. And I think when you finish the project and you've implemented your IT system, then I think it's a good idea, it doesn't often happen, is to actually celebrate that fact. Celebrate, and then sort of, and then move on to whatever else is coming along. But it's a good idea to actually, recognise that you've done a good job,
Yeah, exactly.
And to summarise this, I think, is probably, if you've got a good procurement strategy, then from that putting in place your goals and action plans should be simpler. But if you don't have a good procurement strategy, then it could be more difficult to put in your goals and action plans.
Fantastic summary. And I think on this high note, I think we can round up with this episode. I hope you, dear listeners, have received some of interesting tips from Margaret Gilbert about the best practice for goal setting and action planning. And just to remind to dear listeners that Margaret is not only the consultant and trainer for procurement, but she's the author of Contract Matters books, which you can get actually online. We will attach the link. And Margaret, for action planning and goal setting, what could be the best Contract Matters book that will suit it?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, because every Contract Matters book that I've written, there's always a piece on planning and etc. Of course, this comes under planning, obviously. I think the relevant Contract Matters book would be Contract Matters: A Future for Procurement, because if we're looking at the future for procurement, we need to have a plan, right? Yeah.
So we will leave the link in the description of this podcast episode, and you will be able to find much more to action planning, goal setting, and to many other topics connected to procurement, contract management, and other related topics. Thank you so much for this talk, Margaret, and I hope to talk to you more.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks a lot for being with us until the very end of this podcast episode. As always, Margaret has given a lot of very valuable and practical advice for all of us, and I really hope you can use it in your procurement work. I would like also to pay attention that there is an attachment to this podcast episode. Please check in the show notes. You would have the 8 pages PDF file which you can download, where Margaret has shared her advice about goals and action planning for procurement organizations. So this is a short extract of her advice today, her best practice today. And as always, I welcome you to send your questions and comments to our email info@futureprocurement.net, and of course you can contact us via social media. We are in Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, YouTube, so we would like to stay connected with you. My name is Robert Freeman, and this was Future Procurement. Talk to you soon.